it kind of releases people from making them feel that they're useless or they're greedy or they're weak-willed. Because when you point out to them, actually, you've got some pretty powerful actual medical conditions going on here. And if you don't get these in check, you've got virtually no chance of eating in the way that you would like to eat.
Welcome to the Wise Traditions Podcast, sponsored by the Weston A. Price Foundation for Wise Traditions in Food, Farming, and the Healing Arts. We are your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health.
I'm your host, Hilda Labrada-Gore. This is episode 94, and my guest today is Dr. Zoe Harcombe. Zoe is a popular speaker and the author of several books, including Why Do You Overeat When All You Want Is to Be Slim? In today's episode, she really gets to the crux of the matter of why so many of us feel compelled to keep eating when we know better. She suggests that there are other factors at play. We may have issues with food addiction and struggle with weight loss because of one or more of the following conditions: hypoglycemia, candida, and food intolerances. She enumerates the symptoms associated with each of these so you can more easily identify what's going on in your own body. She also gives us today practical ideas for turning things around. Before we get into the conversation, we want to recognize our sponsors. This episode is brought to you in part by Nourishing Our Children. Nourishing Our Children, timeless principles for supporting learning, behavior, and health through optimal nutrition. Visit nourishingourchildren.org. Hey, and don't forget that the Wise Traditions Conference is coming up in Minneapolis this November, the 10th through the 13th. It's coming up so quickly. So take your health to new heights and go to our website, wisetraditions.org, and register today. Welcome to Wise Traditions, Zoe.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, most people want to be slim or slender more than anything else in the world. What is preventing them from doing that, from losing weight and being the size they want to be?
That was the question that I set out to answer when I was at Cambridge University. And I was working in maths and problem-solving type subjects, and it just seemed to me completely illogical. We want to be slim more than anything in the world, and yet we aren't. And it did not make sense. And it started my journey into looking into food addiction, because I do believe that there are emotional reasons why we have a bad relationship with food, why we overeat, why we abuse food. But I did discover, and I was actually working in the States at the time I discovered much of this, that there are physical reasons for food addiction and cravings. And until we can understand those physical reasons and overcome them, we will continue to be food addicts. So, I believe people start diets with the very best of intentions, but if they're not aware of the conditions that they may well have that are getting in the way of their good intentions, they will really struggle to eat in the way that they would like to eat.
Well, let's dive into that. What are some of these things that are obstacles that they may not be aware of that are kind of sabotaging their efforts?
Okay, so I came across, and as I say, this was when I was working in the States. This information had not come out to the UK at the time. We're now looking at the early 1990s. And I remember when I was working over them in the US, and it was quite lonely. In my work, I was the only person over from the UK. And I used to go to the malls in the evening and the bookshops, and there were coffee shops in the bookshops. And I'd just sit down and, peruse the books. And I remember coming across books, particularly on hypoglycemia, low blood sugar and you was one of the titles, Candida, the Yeast Syndrome, and food intolerance, and issues that people had with particular cravings for particular foods. And when you put those three conditions together, they have some incredible overlaps in terms of things that cause them. They have some very strong overlaps in the perfect diet to overcome each of them. And they have this incredible overlap on the cravings that they can and drive. And they're now reasonably well known. I mean, particularly hypoglycemia, the idea that when you've got low blood glucose, the body's going to do whatever it can to get you to eat, and particularly to eat sugary things that are going to temporarily get your blood glucose back to normal. And then, of course, you overshoot, you eat too much, the body doesn't cope magnificently with insulin. And we're in this sort of sugar high-low roller coaster, which is what a lot of people are experiencing on a daily basis in the Western world.
Most definitely. So let's review those three conditions. One is hypoglycemia. The other two are
Candida, which is also sometimes called the Yeast Syndrome, and then you've got food intolerance.
And you're saying you were reading different books about each of these conditions, and you found that they did overlap and that maybe there's some kind of almost synergy that happens when these are at play in your body.
Absolutely. I mean, I could actually have written my first book sometime in the 90s, but I'd left Cambridge. I'd gone into a pretty good career, was working very hard, just didn't have the time. So it wasn't until 2004 that I actually published my first book, which was called Why Do You Overeat When All You Want Is to Be Slim? And it set out these three conditions and explained how you get them, and explained what symptoms you'll get to know if you've got them, and explained the impact that they have on food cravings. And I just, I read 3 or 4 books. I read several books on each condition, but, there were 3 or 4 absolute classics. Richard McCarness, for example, on food intolerance, Leon Chatow, Trowbridge and Walker on Candida, hypoglycemia, Carlton Fredericks, I think it was, low blood sugar and hue. These books now are sort of 30, 40 years old, but they would still be classics today. And there were passages where the doctors, they were written by physicians, the doctors were describing patients. For example, they might be treating a patient with yeast syndrome and noting that they were driving to the grocery stores in the middle of the night, filling up their trolleys with cartons of ice cream and bagels and muffins and, sugary junk food. And they almost said that as a passing comment. And I was like, whoa, guys, do you not realize what you've hit upon here? People are doing this. People are craving food to this extent. And you're setting out physical reasons as to why they are doing this. And it kind of releases people from making them feel that they're useless or they're greedy or they're weak-willed. Because when you point out to them, actually, you've got some pretty powerful actual medical conditions going on here. And if you don't get these in check, you've got virtually no chance of eating in the way that you would like to eat.
I'm just picturing that person. I'm picturing the person pushing that shopping cart at midnight, filling it up with those bagels and that ice cream, and they do feel defeated, judged, they're dragging, they're discouraged, and you're saying kind of almost it's not your fault. There's something at play that's bigger than you that's driving this behavior.
Absolutely. And it was me personally as well. So when I was at Cambridge, I was the college president for 1 year. In the year before that, I was the college women's officer. And Cambridge is very much in a college system. So you have sort of the central Cambridge University, and then you have your own individual college. So you have representatives from the college. And I remember going up with all the other women's officers up to the central sort of Cambridge training ground. And they said, here's some interesting information on eating disorders. This was sort of the late 80s. And I remember reading it thinking, oh my goodness, I'm doing half of this stuff. I'm binging and starving and craving stuff and eating crazy amounts of particular foods, but I have no interest in, meat and green beans and vegetables and eggs and, plain stuff. None of that holds any interest for me. I just want to eat sweets and chocolate and crisps and ice cream. And I'm reading this stuff thinking, oh my goodness, this is incredible, but it must only be me experiencing this. And then there were only about 20 to 30 women in my college at the time, because Cambridge was very much a male domain, still is in some colleges. And I remember going to the women in the college saying, there's this information coming out centrally. I'm sure it doesn't affect any of you, but, if any of you are interested, pop up to my room and, I can share the information with you. And I think it was something like, 24 out of 25 women came up to see me to say, can I have a read of that information you've got? Because we were classic eating disorder profiles. We were high achievers, middle class, intelligent females, from driven backgrounds, trying to succeed. We were the absolute classic eating disorder type women. And of course, there we all were up at Cambridge, all having a shockingly unhealthy relationship with food. And the UK was just waking up to it at that time. And doctors, your average GP at the time, an anorexic could probably have walked into the doctor's surgery and they'd have had no idea what they were being presented with. We've come a long, long way in 30 years. But, back then, this was new stuff.
Mm-hmm. And they might have thought, well, the person with a food disorder has emotional issues, which may be a part of it, but there may be physical root to the problem as well.
Absolutely. And that's what interested me, because I am aware that there are emotional connections with food. It's the most accessible drug. It's the most acceptable drug. It's a drug that we learn to use for comfort from a very early age. It's used as comfort upon us at a very early age. It's celebratory, it's family gathering. Halloween have sweets, Christmas have sweets, birthday have sweets, any celebration have sweets. We have this, and it's deliberate by the fake food companies. They want from the earliest age we have any awareness of association. They want our association with their junk to be happy, positive, life-affirming experiences. And working as I do with older people, not just children, but particularly not children, but, anyone from sort of 18 upwards, up to sort of 80s, the relationships that those people have with food go right back to the age of 2, 3, 4 teenage years, when food has become disproportionately important in their lives. Mm-hmm. And it's then so difficult to get them to the point that they can have a bad experience, their boss is mean, their children are playing up, their partner is insensitive, and their first thought is food. And breaking that connection is really difficult.
Wow. Well, I want to go back right now, Zoe, to those three things you mentioned, the hypoglycemia, candida, and food intolerance. I feel like you gave us a glimpse of what hypoglycemia is. Can you describe candida and its symptoms, and then a little bit about food intolerances as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And just for completeness, hypoglycemia, if you break it down into its component parts, literally means low blood glucose. And I would say the majority of people in the Western world experience low blood glucose at some point during the day, if not at several points during the day. And the worse that someone's diet is, the more carbohydrate loaded, particularly junk carbohydrate loaded someone's diet is, they will be lurching from low blood glucose to a glucose high on a sort of 20 to 30 minute basis. And when our blood glucose is low, the body has a mechanism for telling us the glucose is low, you're hungry, feed me, I need some glucose, it's gone low. You might get sweaty palms, you might get slightly shaky hands, you might get crabby, irritable, less able to concentrate. You might be at your desk and suddenly realizing you're just not working well anymore. And that will particularly happen if you ate something very starchy 30, 60, 90 minutes earlier. So that one is really, really common. Candida is also manifests itself in as thrush in females, as athlete's foot in either gender, dandruff in either gender. It's called the Yeast Syndrome by another name. And it's essentially, this really gets into Natasha Campbell-McBride's area. And of course, I hadn't heard of Natasha at all when I was at Cambridge. She was probably working elsewhere. Similarly, looking at gut flora and realizing that when gut flora are out of balance, bad things happen. Mm-hmm. And Natasha has taken that to a level, way beyond anything I would ever get close to. I just read up on one particular gut flora, this Candida albicans, that is basically a living organism that feeds off particularly carbohydrate foods, starchy foods, can be encouraged, stimulated by pickled foods, yeasty foods, moldy foods, which is why a lot of the dietary advice will say avoid things like blue cheeses, mushrooms, starchy foods, as well as sort of fungally pickled foods. And that basically, Candida can make somebody just generally feel quite unwell all over. You've not just got athlete's foot, perhaps some dandruff. It can manifest itself in a sort of sleepwalking feeling, a foggy feeling, like you're not quite in the room. You can get all kinds of digestive problems from bloating, constipation, diarrhea, just a general feeling of not being very well and having an inordinate craving for sweet foods, pickled foods. If I ever come across somebody who's craving pickled onions habitually, who isn't pregnant and has got no other reason for doing that, you always suspect either, a salt deficiency because they're following bad dietary advice, or, you might suspect Candida.
Yeah.
So that's how Candida drives cravings. And then food intolerance is really also very common because food intolerance basically comes about when we have the same thing too much, too often. And of course, that is a classic way of describing the US Dietary Guidelines advice for how we should eat, because they essentially want us to have wheat and sugar at virtually every meal.
That's right. A bowl of cereal for breakfast is what I'm thinking. Yeah. A sandwich for lunch with some cookies and chips.
Yep. Yeah, snacks, muffins, cookies, they're perfectly acceptable as snacks. Your dinner should be pasta or pizza because you've got to have more starchy carbohydrates because, goodness knows what would happen if you actually had some red meat and some fabulous, dairy products and all the rest of it. So our crazy advice is getting people to eat the same things far too often and too much of. And we get to the point, which is where I was when I was at university, when that's all I wanted to eat. The things that were actually healthful, the salmon, the green beans, quality dairy products, vegetables and so on. I just had no interest in them whatsoever. I just wanted to eat bread and, cookies and junk all day long.
Wow. And you are not alone, as you discovered there at Cambridge, right? These other women were feeling the same way. And of course, I look around in the U.S. and think you are describing every person walking down the street. Coming up, Zoe makes concrete recommendations to deal with those underlying conditions that could be sabotaging your health and weight loss efforts. She also dives into the fascinating case of Tim Noakes. Tim is a scientist and a professor in South Africa who recently appeared in a hearing before a committee of health professionals for giving advice via Twitter to a breastfeeding mother. Basically, in a nutshell, Tim recommended that she wean the baby onto a low-carb, high-fat diet. This diet is also called the Banting diet, and a complaint was filed against him. So you'll hear about this and more in the rest of the program. First, we want to acknowledge our sponsors. This episode was brought to you in part by Nourishing Our Children. Timeless principles for supporting learning, behavior, and health through optimal nutrition. Their educational materials include a DVD, ebook, audiobook, PowerPoint presentations, and study guide, as well as a children's book. Go to nourishingourchildren.org. Hey, and please mark your calendars for the Wise Traditions Conference in Minneapolis, Minnesota, this November the 10th through the 13th. Zoe will be there, and she'll go in much more depth into this topic of weight loss. And I'm going to be there too. There will be so many speakers and folks there, all sorts of topics covered. Make it a point to join us. The early bird pricing is still in effect, but only for a couple more days. So go to wisetraditions.org, register today, and take your health to new heights. So you consolidated this information you put together into a book, and I imagine you've seen it have some impact on people, right?
Well, it was so funny. I mean, the first book that I published, I was still an HR director at the time. So I was having a nice proper career that was taking me all over the world. I'd worked in the US quite a lot, Canada, the Far East. I've been over to Japan, China, Hong Kong, worked all over Europe. I was still enjoying, really fabulous career. Just managed to get some time to write this book because it's kind of like, I really wanted to do it. And I was challenged on a training course. You've been saying you're going to do this, do it. So I took up the challenge. And I even put my email address in the first book, thinking, 20 people would read it. And then I started getting a couple of emails, and then I started getting a few more emails. And it was just then incredible, people saying, where were you when I was at college? And And I was, addicted to food, and I couldn't understand what was going on. And I was writing back and saying, that was me. I was doing the same thing. It wasn't like I could help myself at the time. It was actually during my first job after college when I had, I guess the loneliness or the good fortune of being, in the States on my own for quite a period of time. And I found solace in the coffee shops with some great books. So, it helped me, and then hopefully I've been able to help people since.
So Zoe, yes, let's talk to that person who's in the coffee shop right now listening to this episode and wondering, where do I begin? Like, what should they get an assessment to see if they have Candida or hypoglycemia, or where should they start?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the things, the book, and there's plenty of stuff online. There was another book that came out, because once the first one started doing well, of course, you then get approached by, the publisher, or can you do another one kind of thing. So I didn't put my email address in that one. But, the publisher said, I'm hearing people calling it the Harcum Diet, so let's call it that. So it's like, yeah, fine, whatever. So, there is a Harcum Diet Club. The harcumdiet.com, has got a lot of information on there. It's got questionnaires on there, and you can just look down the questionnaires and, sort of ask you questions and then give you a score at the end, and then you can say, okay, I probably don't have Candida or hypoglycemia or food intolerance. But because of how shocking our diet is, if people are trying to be good people and following the advice that they're given by our dear governments, the chances are they're going to have at least one of these conditions. And, they are so overlapped. If you're having the cereals and the sandwiches and the stuff that you're advised to eat, and you pick up one of these, the chances are you've probably picked up the other two as well.
Wow.
And, if you have the reaction that I did when I came across it, when you first read the list of symptoms, I remember seeing the book by Leon Chatow, and on the front cover it says, tired, ? Bloated, ? Craving sweet things, ? Feeling like you get up and go has got up and gone. And I'm just looking at this front cover thinking, oh my goodness, you've just described me. How do you know what is happening in my life at the moment? And the symptoms are incredibly similar for food intolerance and hypoglycemia. And thankfully, the diet to overcome all of these three conditions is also incredibly similar. So, the maths in me then came about. I can remember when I got back to my flat in London, I had all these American books all over the floor, and I'd had them sort of all opened and tagged. This is long before the internet. And it was like, okay, so what's the diet advice for Candida? What does Chatow say? What does Trowbridge say? What does Walker say? Take, the safe common denominator. What about food intolerance? Wow. And you get to the point when you realize quality meat. I mean, this is so Western price now, quality meat, fish, doesn't matter if it's tinned or fresh or frozen, tinned sardines with all the bones and the skin are just fabulous. Vegetables, but not potatoes or mushrooms, because Candida ruled those out. Natural live yogurt. So you've got to be getting in your good bacteria. And, that then eggs, of course, that then becomes the basis of the first phase of the diet. And brown rice was generally deemed to be safe in small quantities, and or porridge oats. So it's not, LCHF, it's not a 20 grams of carb a day or something. Even in the first phase, you can be easily, clocking up 100 grams of carbohydrate. Vegetarians can do it. Vegans, it would not be easy or healthy, but that's a separate debate.
Yes.
But the first phase is only 5 days long, and you can make a really big attack on those conditions within that first few days, and then you can move on to the second phase. You can reintroduce more foods, again, more of the things that Western price would embrace. But again, I didn't know about that at the time. But it's what I find really interesting is when you look at food from an evidence perspective, you are all naturally going to end up in the same place. So I'm going to end up where Western Price is going to end up, where Natasha is going to end up, where Professor Tim Noakes is going to end up. We're all going to end up at the same place, because real food, managing your carbohydrate intake, has got to be the right way for us to live as human beings.
Absolutely. Now, you mentioned Professor Tim Noakes. Tell us about this case in South Africa? Why was it so controversial? It had to do with dietary advice. Is that right?
Well, yes and no, and that's the really interesting thing. So in February 2014, we're going back a bit now, Professor Tim Noakes, I think he currently has about 90,000 followers on Twitter. He probably had over 80,000 at the time. Somebody put out a question to him and Sally Ann Creed, who's the dietitian that he worked with on a book called Real Meal Revolution. And I don't have the exact tweet in front of me, but it was some really innocuous question saying, the mum was obviously breastfeeding, saying, I'm a bit worried having cauliflower and something else, will it not give the baby wind? Was basically the query, and it was asked of Tim and Sally Ann Creed. And of course, as is the case with Twitter, when you've got 80,000 followers, you could easily miss it, really easily miss it. You're in a lecture, by the time you've looked back at your notifications, you've got 1,000, so you could miss it.
Yeah.
Tim happened to spot it a day later, and he said something like, don't worry, the baby's not having the cauliflower, baby's having the breast milk. You're the one having the cauliflower, so don't worry about baby in that regard. But the key thing is, he was very positive about breastfeeding, but the message was, when you're not breastfeeding, the key thing is to wean baby onto LCHF. Now, she'd asked a question, she'd used the term LCHF, that was it. So she'd shown that she knew what LCHF was. Right. She was addressing it to the authors of Real Meal Revolution. So and she
just to clarify, and just to clarify for our listeners, LCHF is low carb, high fat, right?
Yes, low carb, high fat, which was very much how you would capture the advice in Real Meal Revolution. It's very much, don't worry about fat. That's not the macronutrient that you should fear, but you really might want to be limiting your carbohydrate intake, particularly for things such as obesity and or diabetes. So she asked a question, he replied, and then suddenly this dietitian called Claire Gilson Stridham, who is conflicted with Kellogg's, among other fake food organizations, jumped in and just started completely overreacting, shouting on Twitter in capitals, oh my goodness, this is dreadful, contact me immediately, Pippa. That was the woman who'd sent the tweet, don't listen to this crazy man. And then the next thing we knew, she's reporting him to the Health Professionals Council of South Africa, which is the body to which she belongs and he belongs. So all health professionals in South Africa, dietitians, doctors, pediatricians, consultants, anaesthetists, any doctor is covered by this general body. And she complained to them saying, he's giving unconventional advice. And he then, first he heard of it was in May, I think, of 2014, when he got a letter saying, you've been charged with giving unconventional advice. What say you? He pretty much went back and said, well, it's not advice, it's Twitter. And it's not that unconventional anyway, because if you look at what we've evolved to eat,
yes.
You'll find out that what I'm saying is pretty bang on, and thought, nothing more would come of it. And then I think it was January the following year. I'll have all the dates, obviously, for my keynote presentation at the conference.
Yes.
Some time later, he got notification from the Health Professionals Council. We are charging you with giving unprofessional advice, misconduct, whatever. I mean, just threw the book at him.
Wow. Zoe... That is crazy. And I think we should leave it as this cliffhanger, because I want to hear the full story at the conference, and this hasn't been completely resolved yet from what I understand. So let's not give it all away.
That's fine. And because I know you've had Nina Teicholz as a keynote speaker as well. So that's when I first met Nina, because I was invited by Tim to be one of the expert witnesses at the hearing in October 2016. So was Nina, and so was a low-carb, high-fat dietitian from New Zealand called Dr. Karen Zinn. So the three girls, basically, we became known as Tim's Angels. We headed over there to help the prof.
Oh my gosh. It sounds like someone should make a movie on this. It's like so fascinating. And
we'll start with the keynote talk and then we'll make the movie after that. How's that?
Okay, that sounds great. Well, we are going to wrap up now. I have to ask you the question I often pose at the end of the program. If the listener could only do one thing to improve their health, what would you recommend that they do?
Oh, so easy. Eat real food. Just eat real food and only eat real food. And then I have, some idiots, particularly dietitians, that will sort of say, oh, well, that's so vague. What's real food? It's like, I'm sorry. I took my 5-year-old niece and I said, real food is food in the form closest to which you find it outdoors. So oranges grow on trees, cartons of orange juice don't. Cows graze in the field, pepperami sticks don't. Fish swim in the sea, fish fingers with breadcrumbs and sugar and maltodextrin on them don't. A 5-year-old can get it. Don't use it as an excuse of, it's too difficult a concept to understand. And, you have idiots saying, oh, where does that leave water? Is water real food? It's like, stop being silly. We're grown-ups. You've got to eat in the form in which nature delivers our food and not in the form that these fake food companies are delivering our food. That will get most people most of the way there. If you're then obese, diabetic, suffering from perhaps PCOS, other conditions, the second thing you want to adopt is you really want to manage your carbohydrate intake. And for different conditions, you really might want to be thinking about going south of 100 grams of carbohydrate a day. And that doesn't mean counting it obsessively. It just means you'll find you come off starchy carbohydrates and prioritize things like quality dairy carbohydrates, quality vegetable carbohydrates. But you'll realize if you've got meat and green things on your plate, the rice or the potatoes or the pasta is bringing nothing in addition nutritionally to the party. You've got everything you need in the meat, the fish, the eggs, the dairy products, the vegetables, the sauerkraut, whatever. You don't need the potatoes or the pasta on the side. So eat real food. And if you've got something else going on, manage your carb intake. And that's all we need to do. Just rip up all the other white papers and dietary guidelines and give people those 3 words.
Well, powerful information you've given us today. I can't wait to meet you in person in Minneapolis, and I hope we get to talk again sometime soon, Zoe.
That would be great. Thanks so much for this invitation. It's been lovely talking to you, and I look forward to meeting you in November.
My guest today was Dr. Zoe Harcombe. For more on her approach to wellness, go to zoeharcombe.com or simply visit our website, westinaprice.org. Go to the podcast page and look for the show notes for episode 94. Hey, and a big thank you to Podcast Village for your support in pulling off the show. Seriously, your help is invaluable. And are you interested in launching a podcast? Check them out at podcastvillage.com. I want to give a special thank you and shout out to intern Olivia Stamforth for all her help with show notes in the past 4 to 6 months. This is her last show that she worked on. Livy is moving on to a new job, and she will be sorely missed. All the best to you, Livy. Hey, and don't forget, everybody, that I am open to your feedback on every show. Let me know what you thought of this one in particular at Holistic Hilda on Twitter. Hey, and if you're still listening, I want to personally invite you to join us at the Wise Traditions Conference in Minneapolis. If you are within driving distance, you need to know that we have a lot of really cool one-day options for you to consider. Sally is offering on Saturday, November 11th, a one-day seminar on nourishing traditional diets. It's a wonderful event, especially for those who are new to Wise Traditions or who just want a refresher on the topic of what Dr. Price has found and the science that backs up his findings. Sally is also offering on Monday, November 13th, a master cooking class. This doesn't happen all the time, so please come out and watch and learn from the best, Sally Fallon Morrell. Check out the wisetraditions.org website for details on all of these things and more, and register for either event or both today.
Have you been enjoying these podcasts? Have you benefited from them or from the resources on the website or local chapter meetings? If so, please become a member of the Weston A. Price Foundation. It's only $25 for students and seniors and $40 for a general membership. Your contribution is critical for the continued work of the foundation. Wise Traditions is brought to you by the Weston A. Price Foundation for Wise Traditions in Food, Farming, and the Healing Arts. The content of this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for medical advice.